My father-in-law told everyone I couldn't provide. Then my wife quietly revealed whose name was on every property we own. My father-in-law liked to say, at nearly every family gathering large enough to have an audience, that his daughter had married down. He never used exactly those words. He was too careful, too image-conscious for anything quite that blunt. But the sentiment came through clearly enough in a dozen smaller comments over the years. Remarks about how I should think bigger, how a man my age really ought to have more to show for himself, delivered with just enough warmth in his tone that calling him out on it directly always risked making me look thin-skinned rather than making him look unkind. It took one specific dinner and one very quiet sentence from my wife to finally put an end to all of it. My name is Samuel. My wife Alexandra and I met in our late 20s, both of us working fairly ordinary jobs at the time, me in property maintenance and light construction, her in nonprofit administration, neither of us from families with significant wealth. Though her father Walter had built a genuinely successful specialty manufacturing business over several decades and had grown, along with that success, an increasingly narrow set of ideas about what kind of life and what kind of husband his daughter deserved. We met, somewhat unglamorously, when I was hired to fix a leaking roof at the nonprofit where Alexandra worked, a small community organization she dedicated her career to despite having grown up with the kind of family wealth that would have made an easier, more comfortable career path readily available if she'd wanted it. I remember being struck, from that very first conversation on her office rooftop, by how little her family's money seemed to define how she actually moved through the world, more interested in the specifics of the roof repair itself than in any performance of status, genuinely curious about the trade in a way most people simply weren't. That quality, more than anything else, was what drew me to her early on, and it's part of why Walter's assumptions about what she supposedly deserved always struck me as so disconnected from who she actually was as a person. I want to explain something about my own career path, because it matters enormously for understanding how the eventual reveal landed the way it did. I'd spent my 20s working construction and property maintenance, genuinely enjoying the physical, practical nature of the work. But I'd also spent those same years quietly developing a parallel interest in real estate investment, something that started small. A duplex I bought at 26 using savings and a modest inheritance from my grandfather, renovated largely with my own hands over evenings and weekends, and rented out for steady, reliable income. That first property led to a second a few years later, then a third, each one funded partly through reinvested rental income and partly through the specific, hands-on renovation skill set my construction background gave me, letting me buy undervalued properties in rough shape and turn them into solid rental assets at a fraction of what a typical investor would have spent on contractors. By the time Alexandra and I got married, I owned, quietly, without much fanfare or public discussion, 6 rental properties across 2 counties, a portfolio that had grown steadily enough that I'd actually cut back on outside construction work significantly, spending most of my time managing and improving my own properties instead. I never made a particular effort to hide this from Walter or my mother-in-law, but I also never made much effort to advertise it either, partly because I genuinely didn't feel the need to justify my worth through a net worth conversation, and partly, I'll admit, because some part of me found it easier to let Walter's assumptions about me run their course than to constantly correct him. There was a specific practical reason for the quiet approach, too, beyond just personal preference. Several of the properties were held under LLCs structured, on our accountant's advice, primarily for liability protection given the rental business, which meant that even a casual look at public property records wouldn't necessarily reveal, at a glance, the full scope of what I actually owned unless someone went looking specifically for the LLC filings and cross-referenced them back to me. It wasn't a deliberate effort to deceive Walter, exactly, more just the ordinary structure any small real estate investor might use. But it did mean that his assumptions about my finances never really had an easy, obvious correction available to naturally interrupt them. Alexandra, for her part, always knew the full scope of what I'd built, having been alongside me for most of it, helping with paperwork, occasionally pitching in on renovation projects during the early years, genuinely invested in the business as a shared project even though the properties themselves were, for various tax and liability reasons our accountant had recommended, held under a series of LLCs with my name as the sole managing member. Walter's condescension started early in our relationship and never really let up, delivered always with a kind of practiced, plausible deniability warmth that made it hard to confront directly without seeming oversensitive. At our engagement dinner, he'd made a comment, ostensibly good-natured, about hoping I had some kind of 5-year plan beyond swinging a hammer. a remark that got an uncomfortable laugh from the table, and that I let slide, telling myself it wasn't worth escalating over on a night that was supposed to be celebratory. I remember another instance, a couple years into the marriage, at a dinner celebrating one of Walter's own business milestones, when he introduced me to a table of his colleagues by saying, with what I'm sure he considered harmless charm, "And this is Samuel. He keeps busy with odd jobs around town, but he makes my daughter happy, so who am I to complain?" The specific phrase, "odd jobs around town," landed with particular sting that night, delivered in front of an entire table of people whose respect clearly mattered enormously to him, while my actual work, 6 properties by that point, tenants, renovation budgets, long-term investment planning, went entirely unacknowledged, flattened down into something that sounded closer to occasional handiwork than an actual, substantial business. Over the following years, that pattern repeated itself at nearly every family gathering large enough to have an audience beyond just the 4 of us, Walter finding some way to reference my career in the most reductive possible terms. "Still doing the handyman thing? Any luck finding something more stable?" Questions and comments that, taken individually, could each be explained away as an older man's clumsy attempt at conversation, but that, taken together over years, built into a consistent, unmistakable pattern of quiet disrespect. The properties themselves, ironically, actually came up in conversation more than once over those years, always in a context that revealed just how little Walter connected them to me directly. At one Thanksgiving, he spent nearly 10 minutes describing, with genuine enthusiasm, a rental property he'd heard about through a colleague, walking the table through the appeal of real estate investment as a wealth-building strategy, entirely unaware that the son-in-law sitting quietly across the table had already built exactly the kind of portfolio he was describing as some aspirational, out-of-reach concept. I remember catching Alexandra's eye across the table during that particular conversation, both of us suppressing a look that said everything neither of us was saying out loud. Alexandra, to her credit, pushed back on her father directly more than once over the years, in private conversations I wasn't present for, but that she'd sometimes recount to me afterward, frustrated on my behalf. Walter, according to her, would always deflect, insisting he was just teasing, or that he just wanted the best for her, never quite willing to hear the actual substance of what she was telling him, that his comments genuinely hurt, that they weren't landing as the light teasing he seemed to believe they were. The specific incident that finally forced a reckoning happened at Walter's 60th birthday celebration, a fairly large gathering at his country club, extended family, long-time business associates, the kind of event where Walter was clearly, visibly in his element, holding court among people whose opinions of him mattered a great deal. Alexandra and I had debated briefly in the car on the way over whether attending large events like this one was even worth the low-grade dread they typically brought on, given Walter's track record. We'd landed, as we usually did, on going anyway, both out of genuine affection for Alexandra's extended family and a kind of stubborn refusal to let Walter's behavior dictate which parts of family life we participated in. I remember walking into that club that evening with the usual low hum of resigned bracing I'd developed over the years, expecting some version of the familiar dynamic, and having no idea, at that point, how thoroughly the evening was actually about to unfold differently than every other gathering that had come before it. I'd been standing near the bar with Alexandra when one of Walter's longtime business partners, a man I'd met only briefly before, asked me, in the friendly, small-talk way people do at events like that, what I did for work. Before I could fully answer, Walter, who'd been standing close enough to overhear, cut in with a laugh that carried just enough of an edge to make clear it wasn't entirely good-natured. "Samuel here does some handyman work, fixes up properties here and there," he said, loud enough that a few nearby conversations paused to listen. "Not exactly what I always pictured for Alexandra, but hey, love finds a way, right?" He said it with a wide, performative smile, the kind designed to read as harmless joking to anyone not paying close attention, while landing to everyone who actually was, as exactly the dismissive insult it was intended to be. I felt my face go hot, the specific familiar humiliation of being reduced, publicly, to a caricature of my own career in front of a room full of people whose respect Walter clearly valued far more than mine. I started to formulate some kind of response, something measured but firm, when Alexandra, standing beside me, spoke first, her voice calm, clear, and pitched just loud enough to carry to the small cluster of people who'd been listening in on Walter's comment. "Actually, Dad," she said, "since you brought it up, you might want to know that Samuel owns 6 rental properties across 2 counties, all of it built from scratch starting when he was 26. And since we're on the subject of property," she continued, her tone still perfectly pleasant, almost conversational. You might also want to know that the vacation house in the mountains that you and Mom have been staying at every summer for the past 3 years, the one you always talk about as the family place, that's actually one of his. He bought it, renovated it himself over about 8 months, and has been letting you and Mom use it rent-free every summer because he knew how much you both loved it there, without ever once mentioning whose name was actually on the deed. I want to describe the specific quality of the silence that followed that sentence, because I don't think I've ever experienced anything quite like it before or since. Walter's face went through several rapid transformations: confusion, then something that looked almost like disbelief, then a slow, dawning humiliation as he processed, in real time in front of the exact audience he'd been performing for, that the man he'd just publicly dismissed as a handyman actually owned the vacation property he'd been quietly, proudly claiming as his own family's place for 3 consecutive summers. "That's not," he started, then stopped, visibly searching for some way to recover the moment that didn't fully materialize. "I didn't realize the specifics of the arrangement," he finally managed, which was, I noted silently, a considerably more careful and respectful phrase than handyman work had been just moments earlier. Alexandra didn't gloat, didn't push the moment further than she needed to, simply excused the two of us for a refill on drinks and let the room absorb what had just happened on its own. I remember the walk to the bar feeling almost surreal, adrenaline, and a strange, quiet satisfaction moving through me in equal measure, watching, out of the corner of my eye, as a couple of Walter's business associates exchanged glances that suggested this particular story would be circulating well beyond that party. I asked Alexandra afterward, once we were home, why she'd chosen that particular moment in front of that particular audience to finally say something so direct after years of letting her father's comments slide by with only private pushback. "Because he spent years doing it in front of an audience," she told me. "Every single comment, every joke at your expense, always timed for maximum witnesses. I thought it was about time the correction happened with the same audience watching." She also told me that same night, something I hadn't fully appreciated before, that she'd actually been carrying the specific detail about the vacation house for months, waiting, somewhat deliberately, for the right moment to use it, not out of any calculated cruelty toward her father, but because she'd wanted the correction to land with real weight rather than getting lost as just another minor pushback he could brush off and forget within the week. "I needed it to actually stick," she said. "Just embarrass him for an evening. I needed him to actually change how he talks about you." Looking back at how genuinely different his behavior has been since that night, I think her instinct about what it would actually take was exactly right. The weeks following that party were noticeably different in terms of how Walter interacted with me. He didn't apologize directly, not in any explicit, "I'm sorry for years of comments" kind of way. That's not really who Walter is, even now. But the tone shifted, unmistakably, questions about my work becoming genuinely curious rather than performatively dismissive. An invitation, a few months later, to a business dinner where he introduced me to a colleague not as my daughter's husband who does some handyman work, but as Samuel, who's built quite an impressive real estate portfolio. A framing that would have felt almost comically overdue if it hadn't also, in its own quiet way, felt like a genuine if belated acknowledgement. I found out through Alexandra that the story of that birthday party moment had indeed circulated well beyond the immediate family in the weeks that followed. One of Walter's business associates apparently retelling it at a golf outing as a cautionary tale about not underestimating people. A version of events that, when it inevitably made its way back to Walter secondhand, seemed to land harder than almost anything Alexandra or I could have said to him directly. There's a specific kind of humbling, I think, that happens when a man who's spent decades carefully curating his reputation among a certain circle realizes that circle is now quietly retelling a story where he's the one who got it wrong. And I won't pretend I didn't feel some satisfaction knowing that particular correction was happening entirely outside my control, propagating on its own momentum through exactly the kind of audience Walter had always cared most about impressing. My mother-in-law Donna, interestingly, told me privately a few weeks after the party that she'd actually known the full scope of what I'd built for years, having picked up on various details Alexandra had shared with her over time, and that she'd tried more than once to gently push back on Walter's comments in private, without much success in actually shifting his behavior. "He needed to hear it in a room he cared about," she told me, echoing almost exactly what Alexandra had said. Private conversations were never going to land the way that one did. Anna also told me something else that day that I've thought about often since, that she'd actually stayed at that mountain vacation house more times than either of us could easily count over the previous 3 summers, genuinely loving the place, describing sunsets and quiet mornings there with real warmth. all while apparently never once asking Walter directly whose name was actually on the property, simply assuming, the way people often do with family arrangements, that the details would sort themselves out eventually without her needing to ask. "I feel a little foolish, honestly," she admitted, "enjoying your generosity for 3 years without even knowing to thank you for it properly." I told her there was nothing to feel foolish about, that the whole point of quietly letting them use the place had been exactly that, generosity without any expectation of acknowledgement, though I'll admit some part of me did appreciate finally hearing the thanks out loud. Walter and I have a considerably better relationship now. More than a year out from that party, not perfect, not without occasional flashes of the old dismissiveness creeping back in during unguarded moments, but fundamentally different in a way that feels sustainable rather than performative. I've since expanded my portfolio to 9 properties, a fact Walter now brings up, unprompted, with something approaching genuine pride when introducing me to new people, a complete reversal from the years of quiet condescension that preceded it. There was one moment, a few months after the party, that stands out to me as the clearest sign that something had genuinely shifted rather than just temporarily softened. Walter called me directly, on my own, no Alexandra on the line as a buffer or intermediary, to ask my opinion on a modest investment property he was considering for his own portfolio, walking me through the numbers the way one investor might consult another, rather than the way he'd always previously spoken to me, as a kind of well-meaning but faintly amused older relative offering unsolicited career advice to someone he assumed still needed it. I remember hanging up that call and sitting in my truck for a minute, genuinely surprised by how much that small, practical gesture meant to me after so many years of the opposite dynamic. I think about that specific moment at the bar sometimes, the particular quality of silence that followed Alexandra's calm, clear correction, and I've come to understand something about it that took me a while to fully articulate. It was never really about the properties themselves, or even about proving my financial worth to a man who should never have needed that proof in the first place. It was about the fact that Alexandra had spent years watching her father diminish me in rooms full of people, and had finally decided, on her own terms, in her own words, that the truth deserved exactly as public an airing as the insults had always received. I didn't need her to defend me. But I've never forgotten that she chose to anyway, precisely, deliberately in the one room where it would finally actually matter.